Hello, Volthaki. Welcome to our latest deep dive. A very warm shout out to Jess, Erry, Clover, and Llyn for recommending this topic today. We cover a lot of tropes in our literary content, and so for today's video, we're finding hilarity in backstories. Welcome to Overtroped. Let's get ranking. We will be starting with our least egregious option today, what the Discord and I call conveniently dead wife. You know, the... Hi, baby. Stop, I'm doing the dishes.
Hey, promise me something. If I die, let it consume you. Under no circumstances are you supposed to move on, except in cases of extremely graphic sex where you torment yourself for succumbing to a base need. Okay?
Those types, you know? It's only overdone because, dare I say it, there's only so much grief I can tolerate surrounding a character I never met. If the past haunts a guy, good, that means that you fleshed him out. But if his entire existence is mourning someone who I will only experience through his memories and with his tinted glasses, it's not something I'm going to emotionally invest in. A dead wife or partner should serve a very specific purpose: guilt, drive, and to show the progression of grief. Guilt has to be tactful. It should be because the character is making progress. That's the whole point. They can't be caught up in the past while simultaneously having zero character development. The guilt should creep up when they're experiencing joy, success, or good fortune. This progress becomes juxtaposed to their loss, and the fact that they're beginning to feel positive emotions means they are moving on even if they didn't mean to. Suddenly, the all-consuming despair they felt has faded, their belief that life cannot move on has been proven wrong, and they feel guilty about it. Meanwhile, the drive should essentially ask the question, why the fuck do we care this person died? What does it mean for those still living? It can't be something as simple as I loved them and now they're dead. It needs to be more interesting than that. Kaladin's perceived inability to save others, Dalinar's personality-changing guilt over the death of his wife, Shallan's DID, these are all products of grief. They're evidence that the loss of an individual has left an identifiable impact. It's about the fact that these characters will never get to see these people again, and what it means to live life without them. The people who pass have dreams and goals that are more impactful when they haven't been achieved. You know, nobody can really mourn the 130-year-old philanthropist with a PhD, 9 children, and a summer home. Struck down in her prime. But you see my point. Those left behind should carry a piece of those that they grieve, seeking to introduce something to the world in honor of that person's legacy. Lastly, we need to discuss the progression of grief, because people do move on. Not in the Grey's Anatomy offhand comment that my sister got eaten by wolves, let's never talk about this again, but as a natural readjustment to a new reality. This doesn't mean the dead are never mentioned again, but it becomes more about the fond memories, happiness, and impact they brought, as opposed to the gaping wound of their absence. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to live in honor of those memories instead of being consumed by them. I'm actually going to jump back to the Grey's Anatomy thing for a second because I let that show get away with so much before I finally tapped out. Don't grieve like this. First of all, there's a reason why people sit Shiva. Losing someone is hard. Don't go to work if you lost your sister, especially if you're a doctor. I just don't think you're going to be at the top of your game given the circumstances. But I can segue here to point out that in your world building, you should showcase what mourning looks like. Ritual, style of dress, religious implications of different practices. All of that will tie into how someone progresses through the stages of mourning, and their perspective on an afterlife will also inform these ideas. Moving on to the next least egregious backstory option, we have the small town prodigy. And I rank this quite highly because nobody wants to read about some Joe Schmo, especially in a fantasy context. The fact of the matter is, if the character is central to the story, there is going to be something special about them. Kaladin was a natural spearman. Gabrielle de Leon was the product of an unholy union. Kip Guile is the son of one of the most important men in his world and the heir to his power. Violet Sorrengail is incredibly delicate but also competent. It's how it goes. What I will say is that you mustn't rush to equate prodigiousness to raw power. It's more about the mindset of the individual. They're a small town prodigy not because of a natural talent for magic or warfare, but because of their extreme desire for improvement. We see this really well with Weishi, Llyn, and Aurelius from the Cradle series, of course I'm going to mention Cradle, who begins his story as the lowest caste in society, unworthy of practicing magic or even receiving the necessary resources to develop it in the first place. When he eventually is given the opportunity and accumulates a significant fortune as a sacred artist, his attempt to raise his family up alongside him hits several roadblocks, as despite his relatives now receiving all of the resources he was denied, they still weren't as dedicated, committed, or as capable as he was. This becomes a source of more than a few comedic moments throughout the series where Lyndon realizes other people are not as competent as he is, but that's the point. The prodigy is defined by their drive, not their strength or weaknesses, as especially in the case of progression fantasies like Cradle, the opportunity to no longer be a weakling is too great to pass up. The prodigy especially seeks to take control of their own destiny, almost always because they have suffered at the hands of someone who is more powerful than them. There is something very gratifying in journeying with a character and seeing them at their lowest, especially once they've evolved to become a planet-destroying threat. Do not be afraid of making your character special. They're the center of your story. They're supposed to be. Obviously, this leads into concerns of plot armor and, in the case with female characters, Mary Sue accusations, but you're gonna get them anyway. You might as well write. That's what it means to be a writer. If you write a woman, someone is gonna be upset. But my therapist's advice, paraphrasing, is don't argue with people who you wouldn't trust for instructions on how to tie shoelaces. The way to avoid it being the truth, though, is to make sure your character scales properly with their environment. 9 times out of 10, natural talent doesn't beat experience or training. That's normally why they throw themselves into it in the first place. Your character can still be naive, inexperienced, or struggle with certain aspects. Aang was a brilliant airbender, the youngest master ever, but he still struggled to learn earthbending despite having done it in 100 previous lives. Furthermore, not every aspect of a character should be combat related. People despise Llyn for this, but it's the truth. Not everyone can be a warmonger. Not everyone, even those trained with weaponry, are best suited for direct confrontation. Expound on your prodigy's capabilities. If everyone is using Fireball, Fireball isn't interesting. Fireball! Up next, we have a partner to the dead wife trope, and that's called dead family. While these two have solidly 90% overlap, I would argue they are a necessary component and a good indicator of what I call get to the fucking point. I don't need backstory ad infinitum. Nobody does. Sometimes the motherfucker and the mother are dead and it's fine. Obviously, this can tie back to the same concepts we discussed with the dead wife: drive, guilt, and progression of grief, but you need to know when to do it. To stick with our book club Stormlight theme, Llyn, dead family, incredibly important to her character, a focal point of background events, and no, I'm not going to elaborate further on that, a major driver to her personality flaws, weaknesses, and overall growth. Meanwhile, Jasnah, dead dad, not particularly important to her. Yes, Gavilar's death is a major cornerstone in the events of the Stormlight Archive, but in terms of the specific father-daughter dynamic that we uncover, Jasnah was pretty much always who she was prior to her father's assassination. Her heresy, intelligence, interest in the cognitive realm, and the Knights Radiant, all this predated Daddy's death, and her grief over did not bring this to a halt, but rather exacerbated her desire for answers. At the end of the day, the important part of Jasnah's stories was relatively independent of her relationship with her parents, so much so that we're essentially as concerned with her dynamic with her living mother as we are her dead father. In fact, Navani is another great example of this. She's a mother, and we see this in her mothering of Llyn as well as her actual children, and she's a widow. But as we learn more about her dynamics with her dead husband, as the story progresses, her main interests and the main connection she has to the reader is personal. In fact, it's distinctly independent of her identity as wife or mother. The dead family in this case is an accent, not a focal point. Especially considering the end of Wind and Truth, Navani's character has so much more to show beyond her relationships. Oftentimes, the family can be a character block. A child that doesn't leave home doesn't have the opportunity to grow into any sort of meaningful adult. Hell's world building. We see the same idea with Jeanette McCurdy's I'm Glad My Mom Died. Life for her started after that event. The gist of this concept is to choose wisely where you're going to start someone's story. Certain things are better left in the backstory, and not everything is important enough to be included in that backstory. Do we know Dalinar's parents' names? Of course not, because that's irrelevant to who the Blackthorn is. All we know about the familial relationships is what's necessary to contextualize the character's identity beyond them. Okay, I'm done. Now, in terms of my least favorite backstories and backstory-adjacent things, this is contender for second place: the prophecy. I just think it's super lazy if you don't expound on how future sight works in your writing. The Cosmere has a defined force known as fortune, with limits on future sight that affects even gods. The Way is similar, with different sacred artists having different talents for seeing potential futures. Someone connected to the dream icon will be far better at it than someone connected to the blood icon. That kind of deal. But the worst instance of this kind of thing is when the prophecy is mixed with the child prodigy. I hate it. The character is important because they were always going to be important is the laziest possible situation you could configure, and here's how to fix that. First, define your future sight. Second, make your character's importance a fluke, Donna in Doctor Who style. You can raise someone up to be important by coincidence. Their presence at a world-altering event, like in the case of Llyn, is far more interesting because we don't know if they're actually up to the task. Conversely, you can red herring the prophecy. A misinterpretation or mistranslation could raise up the wrong figure when the correct person was there the whole time. It's an unfortunate consequence of the fantasy genre that almost inevitably a prophecy gets involved in order to explain a sequence of events. The Deck of Dragons in the Malaysian series is a prime example of this, with a key feature being that power tends to attract more power, so the most important players are always drawn towards specific events. The world you're building is probably big. There needs to be some archetypal force that pushes players together. All I'm asking is that you flesh it out. Okay, my final trope of the evening is one that will make me DNF a show or book, and that is the useless dad. I despise this shit. Not because useless fathers don't exist, but when it's used as comedy, it pisses me off. Look, if we're talking Shameless, obviously that's the point. That's what drives a large portion of the show, but Steven Universe? Loser dad living in his car with no custody of his kid, and apparently it's fine because he's being raised by 3 aliens. This is not to say this is inherently a bad trope, but I'll take idiot parent over incompetent one. Lyndon's father is jaded, pun intended, by his lack of understanding of the world. He cannot fathom a situation in which his son is as successful as he comes to be. And this mindset really hurts his son, but that's better than having just a useless fuck parent. It's not much deeper than that. So what I will say is if you're going to utilize parents as an antagonistic force, make it about their worldview, not their competency. Llyn, Kaladin's father, hates his son's penchant for combat, but just because he doesn't fight doesn't make him useless. I don't think his worldview is particularly correct, especially in the context of the Desolations, but he is still defined by a steadfast belief instead of an incompetency. So to recap, structure your backstories, know what should and shouldn't be included, make sure loss and grief are experienced with the intent of development, and that parental figures are obstacles you must navigate around, not dumb impediments in the way. And try to do something other than a prophecy, but if you have to, be clever about it. Thank you so much for joining us today. A huge shout out to our lovely Discord for recommending this topic. If you haven't yet, check out the Volthakian Literary Universe on Patreon or our blog at galaxander.com for ways to join. Heads up, our Eldritch tier members can now fill out a character creation form to get featured in future editions of our Tales of the Crone short stories. Don't forget to fill it out, and I'll catch you in the library for our community game nights, movie nights, or book club meetings. I'll see you next time.